Lindsay Sturkey, and welcome to Simple Spiritual Practices. This episode is part of the Summer Replay series featuring some of my favorite episodes and foundational practices. In each episode of this podcast, we'll talk about one tangible practice that will help you know yourself and God better. Most of these practices can be done in 5 minutes or less, so you can easily try it out today. If you are ready to experience real growth in your life, or if you want fresh ideas on how to approach your time with God, this podcast is for you. Most of us are probably familiar with the term quiet time. It's what we usually call the time that we spend with God. But most of our quiet times actually involve very little quiet, because typically we'll read a passage of scripture, then we pray, which means us saying words to God. And there's not a lot of quiet in there. Even if you're not actually speaking words out loud, there are still a lot of words because we're reading words and then we're praying words. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, because reading our Bibles and praying to God is a very important foundation of our time with Him. And the practices that we'll talk about in this podcast, they're not meant to replace reading our Bibles or prayer. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But what would it look like to reclaim the quiet part of our quiet time? So just as a quick reminder, every week on this podcast, we're going to talk about one spiritual practice that will help you create space for God. And if you missed the first episode, I definitely encourage you to go back and listen to that as well, because I really spent some time talking about the heart and vision behind this podcast and why these simple spiritual practices that we'll talk about are so important when it comes to growth and change in our walk with God. So when I thought about the first practice that I wanted to talk about on this podcast, it really was a no-brainer. I knew that I wanted to start with the practice of silence. Because if we think about what it means to create space for God through practices, the best way I know to do that is through the practice of silence. If you were to ask me, where should I start? If you weren't sure where to begin when it comes to spending time with God, or if you told me that you felt stuck in a rut, that maybe your time with God was kind of falling flat sometimes and you didn't know what to do about it, this is what I would tell you to do. Simply sit in silence. I really feel like this is the place that we need to begin before we do or talk about anything else. I think a lot of times we try to change our life through effort and through action. We try really hard to be better. But as we talked about last week, that is not the way to growth that will last, because we need to create space for God to do what only He can do. So by practicing silence, we remove not only effort and action, but words and noise as well. This is a great place to start if we want to approach growth and change in a different way. Now, before you think I'm going to tell you to go to a retreat center and spend hours staring at a wall or something, let me assure you that we're going to start small with something that any of us can do. And just as a reminder, the practices we'll talk about on this podcast will only take you 5 minutes, including this one. Our lives are really full of noise. And a lot of times this is noise that we choose. We'll have music playing or a podcast playing in the background, or we constantly have a show on going as we're kind of going through our day, even if we're not exactly watching it. And then there's other noise in our life that we don't have much control over. So I have 2 of the loudest children I've ever met. They have really big personalities, and I love that about them, but they do not bring a whole lot of quiet or silence to my life. So because so much of our life is filled with noise, silence can feel pretty radical. It can feel uncomfortable to us, and we kind of tend to avoid it. And that's why it can be such a powerful tool when it comes to living life in a different way. So allow me to demonstrate just how different silence can feel with just 10 seconds of silence right now. So we're going to try this now together. We're going to do kind of a mini practice of silence right here in the middle of this episode. So here is what just 10 seconds of silence feels like. Ready? Let's begin. So how did that feel to you? I promise it was just 10 seconds. I set a timer. Did that feel like the longest 10 seconds of your life? Or maybe for you, it wasn't enough and you found yourself longing for more silence. Either way, silence can feel awkward and uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's why it's something we have to practice at and start small with it. So depending on what you are doing even right now, you might have been driving or just sitting still and listening. That can also affect how silence feels to you. So just pay attention to how that felt for you. Consider if you felt relief or maybe you felt resistance. Either feeling is okay. Just kind of name to yourself how that felt. See, I think that because silence is so radically different from how we spend most of our days, it can be that much more powerful. It gives us just kind of the stark contrast to the noise and activity that fills our lives. When we practice silence, it allows us to decompress from that. It gives us space to breathe, to rest our minds, and to listen to God. Because here's the thing, if we want to hear from God, if we want to grow, not only in our lives in general, but in our relationship with God, we have to create space for listening. If we're going to hear God's voice, we need space and silence to hear Him. And that requires that we stop the noise and hold some space for silence. So let's talk about how to do that. The practice for this week is simply this: spend 5 minutes in silence. Now, before I walk you through this practice, I want to talk a little bit more about the purpose of this time, because sometimes we approach silence and end up making it just one more place of noise in our life. Silence is not just about removing external noise, but getting quiet internally as well. So first, let's talk about what this time of silence is not. This is not praying words to God. We're not asking Him for things or thanking Him for things or telling Him things. Obviously, those are all good things to do, but that's not what this time is about. The second thing this time is not about is getting warm, fuzzy spiritual feelings. So you may finish this 5 minutes of silence and feel like you got nothing out of it. The timer goes off and you're like, well, I did it, but I don't feel any different and I didn't really hear anything. And that's okay. We're not going after a certain feeling. We're simply showing up and creating space. This is also not about hearing answers from God. So just like you may not feel anything specific, you may not hear anything either. And it's true that you might, but we're coming to God without an agenda. We're not demanding that He tell us anything or give us any answers. Okay, so it's not those things. So what is the purpose of silence? Here's what the time of silence is. The first thing is that we are creating space for God. So if we genuinely want to connect with God, are we making time for Him? Are we listening? Or are our lives so full and busy with activity that there's no room for Him? Practicing silence is slowing down long enough to recognize that God's presence is always with us, and we are simply taking time to step outside of the noise and busyness and to notice that and having space for God to meet with us. So the next thing this practice is it is about resting in God's presence. We're not doing anything for God during this time. We are choosing to simply be with Him. As we said before, this is not about getting something out of the time. It's enough simply for us to be with God and for Him to be with us. So it's okay if your mind wanders or if you struggle to stay present in it. This is about rest, not striving. And so don't have the mindset of doing this really well. That's not what it's about. So the third thing that this is about is allowing your mind to slow and settle. Our minds tend to be full and busy, and when we're constantly in motion, it's like there's things in our heads that just kind of tend to build up. So when we practice silence, it gives space for those thoughts that keep going to just kind of slow down and stop racing. And there's actually another simple practice that can help with this, and we're going to talk about that practice next week, so make sure you check out that episode. But for now, just pay attention to how your thoughts might compete with the silence. It's okay if you can't seem to slow them down, that they're kind of getting in the way. That's all right. Simply recognize it's happening. No need for guilt. We're just noticing. So next, we're going to talk about exactly how to do this practice. Now, obviously, this is not complicated. I could just tell you, spend 5 minutes in silence and leave it at that. But I really want to walk you through the exact steps of how I approach this. I kind of want to just walk you through your mindset and your expectations as you go into this time, because I do think that's a crucial part of this. Now, before I go through those steps, I do want to tell you that I am creating a step-by-step guide for each episode because I want you to know exactly what to do for each of these practices. And that way you have something that you can kind of refer back to later when you're doing the practice, and this guide is going to walk you through how to do it. So there's a couple ways that you can get this guide. The first is that I'll always have the steps for the practice listed in the show notes, so you can always refer to those. Or if you want a copy of the practice guide that you can keep, you can sign up to get that in a weekly email. So that way the guide will come right to you for each new practice. I'm also going to include a free printable guide in that email. So if you want, you can just print yourself a copy, and that way you can refer back to it when you do the practice, or you could save it to your computer or phone just to have easy access to it later. So if you want that weekly email, I have that at lindsaysturkey.com/free, and that's where you can sign up, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. So that way you have just easy access to that guide when you're going to do the practice. When you're ready to try the practice of silence, here are the steps for how to do that. Number 1 is to pick a time in the next 24 hours to do this practice and put it on your calendar. So make sure that this is a time when you're least likely to be interrupted. You may even want to set a reminder on your phone so that you don't forget to do it. So for me, I sometimes do this practice in the morning as part of my quiet time before my kids get up. Other times, it's really helpful to do it in the middle of the day, especially if I find I'm getting stressed or impatient or I'm just having a hard time. I might stop for 5 minutes and do this practice. Or other times I might do it right before bed just to kind of decompress from the day. This is going to be different for everyone, so just think through your specific day and try to figure out when do you have 5 minutes that you could do this. So the reason I'm encouraging you to do this within 24 hours is that we might have really good intentions of trying this out, but then we forget about it because life just kind of gets in the way. So decide now before you move on with your day, when will this be for you? And then tangibly take out your phone and ask Siri to remind you at that specific time. Actually do this because I know that we all intend to get around to it, but life gets loud and takes over and we forget, and that's okay. That's why we have Siri or Alexa or whatever else to remind us. That's why they are here. So step 1 was to pick a time and commit to it, setting a reminder so you don't forget. Number 2 is when it's time to begin your practice of silence, set a timer on your phone for 5 minutes. This is a crucial step because you don't want to have to keep looking at the clock to see when the time is over. That kind of defeats the purpose, so make sure to set a timer. Step 3 is close your eyes and open with a simple 1-sentence prayer. God, I'm here and I'm listening. And those are all the words that you'll pray during this time. Again, this time is about silence, not filling it with words either in your head or out loud. So just start with a simple 1-sentence prayer. Step 4 is simply be still and rest. Be open to what God might do or say, but as much as you're able, surrender any expectations you have and lay down any agenda you might be carrying. This is not about results, but simply showing up and creating space. Number 5, when the timer goes off, end your time with a short 1-sentence prayer of gratitude for the time of quiet in God's presence. So number 6 is kind of a bonus step. This is beyond the 5 minutes, but it could be helpful to reflect on how the experience was for you. You could even journal out your thoughts if that's helpful, or just kind of ask yourself, just check in about how did I feel? Did the experience of silence bring relief or resistance? Again, just like we said earlier, either of those feelings is okay. We're not judging, we are simply noticing and naming it. So I want to challenge you, do this practice at least once in the next week. But you could even take it a step further and try it a few times or maybe even once a day. Notice if it gets easier or how maybe one day it might not connect with you, but then other days it feels really meaningful and life-giving. It's not going to feel the same every day that you do it. And whatever your experience is with this, however you feel about it is okay. Because some days I do this and I hear something really specific from God. Other times it's just kind of a time of rest. And then there's other times where it honestly feels a little bit like a waste. But I'm trusting that as I create space for God, He is doing an inner work, even if I can't see it or feel it. So I keep showing up and I keep practicing. Now, if you're willing, I would love to hear from you how it went. Was it a struggle? Was it refreshing? Was it hard or easy? So if you're willing to share, I would just love to hear what this was like for you. You can send me a message directly through Instagram or Facebook or contact me through my website. I really would love to hear from you. So let me know how it goes. I also want to encourage you that the more you do this practice, the more natural it will feel. And for some of you, 5 minutes will feel like forever. And for others, it won't feel like enough. And that's okay. There's a reason that this is called a practice. We're not after doing it right or getting something out of it. It's enough to simply show up and create space. So I hope that as you practice silence this week, that you will find rest, that you will find the presence of God, that you will let it be enough to just show up and practice this wonderful gift of silence. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Simple Spiritual Practices. If you want to download a free toolkit of 5-minute practices or find other resources to help you take next steps, visit lindsaysterkey.com/free. This podcast is part of the New Hope Podcast Network and production is done by Darren Hansen. You can check out all the podcasts on the network by visiting newhopechurch.cc/listen. Make sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode in our summer replay series, and we'll be back with new episodes this fall.